A couple months ago, Kamala Harris just lost a presidential election. That means she becomes the 40th entry into the list of almost presidents, which is a list of all the people who finished second place in a presidential election while not being the sitting president. She is the 40th person on the list. And so if we're going to look at what Kamala Harris is going to do now in the future, let's look at what these 39 other individuals did after losing their presidential elections. Now, Kamala Harris does not have as much time as some of these people do. Kamala Harris is older than average, being 60 at the time of her losing the election, as opposed to the average age of 55. And of the other 39 people on this list, 12 did not again run for any office. There are some interesting stories in that group. For one, Horace Greeley, in the loser of the 1872 election, actually died 1 month after the election and before the Electoral College could even vote, which led to a really weird Electoral College result in 1872. On the flip side, Alpha Landon lived 51 years after losing the 1936 election, finally dying at the age of 100. He never ran for office again. Bob Dole, the loser of the 1996 election, used his celebrity to get on TV and to sell his books. The loser of the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton, has not returned to government, but has also been writing books. The other 27 did stay involved in politics and government. 5 served as governor. The loser of the 1812 election, DeWitt Clinton, won 4 more terms after losing the 1812 election. John Fremont, the loser of the 1856 election, was a frontiersman in his youth and got to be governor for the Arizona Territory after the Civil War. None of these people went on to serve in the House of Representatives, but 10 served in the United States Senate. The loser of the 1848 election, Lewis Cass, was in the United States Senate, even becoming president pro tempore of the Senate for one day. Stephen A. Douglas, the 4th finisher in the 1860 election, died 7 months after the election as a member of the United States Senate. Barry Goldwater, the loser of the 1964 election, won 3 more terms for the Senate in Arizona and remained an honest, active critic of his party until his death in 1998. Now, 4 of the people on this list might offer some additional into what Kamala Harris would do, because they were also sitting vice presidents at the time when they lost presidential elections previously. Most recently, Al Gore, who was Bill Clinton's vice president, lost the 2000 election. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president for Lyndon B. Johnson, lost the 1968 election. Richard Nixon, the vice president for Dwight Eisenhower, lost the 1960 election, but would go on to win the 1968 and the 1972 presidential election. And finally, John C. Breckinridge, who was James Buchanan's vice president, lost the 1860 election. Now, Richard Nixon was not the only person to try again and run for office again. A lot of these people were their party's nominees for president after losing the election previously. Charles Pinckney, the loser of the 1804 election, lost again in 1808 before retiring from politics to a life of farming. Henry Clay, who had already finished 4th place in the election of 1828, lost as the National Republican Party in 1852 and created the Whig Party, whose nominee he was in 1844 when he lost yet again. William Jennings Bryan, the loser of the 1996 presidential election and 1900 and 1908 presidential election, lost all 3 times. Thomas E. Dewey, the loser of the 1944 election, decided to run again in 1948 and lost, even though some newspaper publishers thought he would beat Harry Truman. Shortly thereafter, Adlai Stevenson II, the loser of the 1952 election, lost in 1956 again. In fact, a lot of people on this list have actually served as Secretary of State after losing the presidential election previously, which includes Lewis Cass, the loser of the 1848 election, who was Secretary of State under James Buchanan. James Blaine, who was already the Secretary of State for James Garfield, was Secretary of State for Benjamin Harrison. William James Bryan, the loser of the 1896 election, 1908 and 1900 election, was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. Charles Evans Hughes, the loser of the 1960 election, was the Secretary of State for President both Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. And most recently, John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State under President Obama. In fact, 12 remained involved in foreign affairs. Winfield Scott, the loser of the 1852 election, is mentioned in the oversimplified video People, where he goes and resorts a fellow Great Britain. He eventually got dismissed from the army for being too fat. John Kerry, the loser of the 2004 election, which I just mentioned earlier, was a notable Secretary of State under President George W. Barack Obama, and held a foreign policy under President Biden as well. Now, 4 people did go on to win presidential elections and actually become president, which includes John Adams, the loser of the 1789 and 1792 election, won a rematch against Thomas Jefferson in 1796. Thomas Jefferson, the loser of the 1796 election, won a rematch against Aaron Burr in 1800 and showed 2-4 towards Andrew Jackson, the second place finisher in the crazy 1824 election, won a rematch against John Quincy Adams in 1828 and showed 2-4 towards William Henry Harrison, B. Martha Van Buren in a rematch in 1840. Died 1 month into his term, and over 100 years would pass before the next and most recent successful turn to a presidential election, which was Nixon in 1968 after losing the 1960 election. So that is what every almost president did after losing presidential elections. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing.